Welcome back, everybody. And today we have the great James Tucker. And I just I always kick it back, but I'd like you to introduce yourself, Mr. Tucker.
I'll do that. My name is James Tucker. I am the director of ADAP. That's the Alabama Disabilities Advocacy Program. We are the federally funded advocacy program for people with disabilities in Alabama. ADAP has been around now for more than 40 years at the University of Alabama in the law school, and I have been a civil rights lawyer for more than 30 years, and have been at ADAP for more than 20 years. So really happy to be here today with Alex and everybody who's joining us.
Now, we did get to speak with Mrs. Nancy Anderson a few weeks back. I guess it was a few months back. But for anybody that wasn't able to see that, if you could give us a little bit of history of ADAP.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So in the 1970s, after cases like Wyatt versus Stickney in Alabama and some other similar cases around the country, our Congress decided that as a matter of public policy, it is important to fund legal advocacy for people with disabilities. So Congress created a network of advocacy offices like ADAP. So there is an ADAP-like entity in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and each of the U.S. territories. So we work very closely in a national network with our colleagues, and very often we make referrals to another state, or we might receive a referral from another state as well.
Now, you say referral, is that when somebody's moving or
That's a classic issue. So, for example, a family may be moving to Alabama and be curious about what benefits would my child be eligible for in special education or community supports. We would want to talk to that person to give them a realistic expectation of what they might experience in Alabama, and vice versa. We might make a referral. For example, I can remember a prominent case where I made a referral when I had a client moving to New York City.
Now, is there quite a bit of difference between the states and how they're able to serve individuals? Do you notice quite a bit of difference there?
There is actually quite a bit of difference. Let me give you a concrete example, a very specific example. The state of Alabama runs about as minimal a Medicaid program as you can run and comply with federal law. So a concrete example. In Alabama, an adult on Medicaid is not entitled to dental care as a matter of course unless it's a medical emergency. In most states, adults obtain dental care routinely through Medicaid.
Yeah.
That's a really simple, concrete example.
Now, that brings up a good point, because I have a family member that's on services, and she, through Medicaid, even through her insurance, we have to pay out of pocket for her dental there. And we go to UAB Sparks, which I absolutely love, which helps us kind of keep those costs down. And they're very good there, but I never thought of that. That's a really good point.
I've met your family member. I have a great regard for her. And I think you and others who live in the greater Birmingham area are fortunate to be able to obtain a service like that kind of dental care. But imagine living in rural Alabama where there's one dentist in the county and where that dentist doesn't take Medicaid to begin with. Access to dental care for adults is a significant challenge in this state, partly because of the issues that we're talking about.
Yeah. You hit that on the head. One thing that we talked about before we went live, I have my history and experience is more in the developmental disability community, but there's also the mental illness side of mental health. Now, does ADAP cover both entities there?
We do, and in fact, we cover more broadly. I'll come back to that piece specifically, but more broadly, ADAP, think of ADAP as a nonprofit law firm for people with disabilities. All disabilities, all over the state, all 67 counties. We receive almost 10,000 phone calls a year asking for our legal assistance. Eligibility is based on disability status, not income status. So while many of the people whom we serve may live in poverty,
Mm-hmm.
That is not how we determine eligibility for our representation.
So that never comes across the table. Well, that brings up a point. Does it cost anything for ADAP services to the individual?
ADAP services are free to the qualifying individual. One thing that families sometimes kind of struggle with a little bit is to appreciate that we, as a nonprofit law firm, our obligation in an attorney-client relationship is to the person with a disability.
Mm-hmm.
We want to help that person express him or herself. If there's a guardianship, we are obliged to communicate with the guardian, but our obligation is to the person with a disability. So that's the starting point. To go back to your question about the relationship between our work on mental illness issues and developmental disabilities issues, I think a fundamental and important starting place for any discussion like this in our state is a brief reference to the Wyatt versus Stickney case. Before Wyatt versus Stickney, an important federal court case, before those decisions came down in 1971 in federal court in Montgomery, happens to be the same court that ruled on the Selma to Montgomery voting rights march.
Okay.
And the same court that ruled on the Montgomery bus boycott. So a rich civil rights history.
Mm-hmm.
But Wyatt versus Stickney started essentially in the following way. Until the Wyatt case, an individual who is involuntarily civilly committed, for example, to Bryce Hospital,
mm-hmm.
had no legal right to treatment. So the state had the power to put a person away in an involuntary manner and not serve or treat them. That was the law until 1971.
Awesome. That would be like you could put somebody in a room and not have to see them again.
That's exactly correct. So just to give you kind of a concrete specific of what it looked like in 1970 when the case was filed, there were more than 5,000 individuals confined at Bryce against their will, and there were 3 doctors.
5,000 people with 3 doctors?
Yes, sir.
Wow.
So that illustrates why Wyatt became known, not just in Alabama and the U.S., but literally in the world. 1971 was the first time any court anywhere had said that those persons have a right to treatment. And a federal court in Alabama in 1971 said that that is a right under the U.S. Constitution. You cannot deprive one of his or her liberty, supposedly for the purpose of giving treatment, and not give treatment. That's the core of the case.
It's crazy to think that that was only 50 years ago. Shortly, about 50 years ago.
That's right, it is, absolutely. And we hope to do an event in the next couple of years to celebrating the progress that has been made and to ask questions about the work still to be done. But you're right, roughly 50 years ago, and it's important to appreciate what that helps us to understand in the way that the rights of persons with disabilities have evolved in this country and in our state.
Mm-hmm. One of the people that I met with when I first came to Alabama was Associate Commissioner Courtney Tarver. He was at the time the Associate Commissioner, and I didn't know much about developmental disabilities, mental health, and he really, at the end of our conversation, introduced me to it, but kind of at the end said this to him was really, it was very reminiscent of a civil rights movement, and I'm starting to see that being looped back.
He and I agree about that. We've had similar conversations. Let me just say that I have immense regard for Mr. Tarver, who retired within the last year or so. I think something sometimes that people don't appreciate, and we say it a lot at ADAP, and we may say it sometimes and it may be hard to appreciate. We really keenly advocate that disability rights are civil rights. And when you think about it in that context in Alabama, especially with our rich civil rights history, mm-hmm. I think you can appreciate maybe in a fuller way the importance of the ongoing disability rights movement.
Mm-hmm. And it kind of sinks in there and it hits home, and it's like, I understand it better by that analogy.
I appreciate the chance to say a few words about it.
So I want to talk a little bit about some of this. Oh, kind of a quick question though. Do you ever have differences between like a legal guardian and an individual when they come to you, the individual says, and then you reach back out to them, and then a legal guardian or say, well, I don't think that's right? What happens there?
That's a really great question, and the answer is yes, of course we do. So it breaks out in a couple of ways, and I'll try to describe it kind of in a thumbnail. When you're talking about the relationship between a guardian and a minor, it's very clear under the law that the guardian has full power. Maybe you would only look at questions of an abuse of that power. But when you look at the relationship between a guardian and an adult, sometimes a guardianship may have been gained or imposed through questionable or dubious measures. Mm-hmm. Guardianship exists only as an operation of a court order. So if we are presented with a case in which a person who is subject to a guardianship, a person with a disability, has a fundamental dispute with his or her guardian, there are times when we might go back to a probate court in Alabama
and say, I don't know if they're the right person.
Exactly, and challenge the imposition of the guardianship or the question of who is serving as guardian, or we might even look at a case and say, maybe some supervision is appropriate, but maybe a limited guardianship is more appropriate than a full guardianship. Yeah. So yes, it's a very good question.
Yeah, so you would have to go, if it came all the way down to the wire and the guardian and the person who, the individual, weren't in agreement at the end, you would have to go back to the court system and say, we need to reassess this guardianship for the best interest of the individual.
That's exactly right. You've hit the nail on the head. So you can appreciate, we get a lot of phone calls with a lot of concerns and questions. We have to sort through those phone calls, and every phone call is not a good legal case. By the time we've determined that a case has merit, I'd say often as not, the lawyers working on cases like the guardianship question that you're presenting, by the time we get involved in a case, sometimes we're able to resolve it if we just tell the other side, hey, we're going to court.
Yeah.
Then they have to kind of confront the reality of what they may have done to gain the guardianship. They may not want to go back to court and test that question.
Yeah. Very powerful. That's a very powerful thing for the individual.
It is powerful, and I think it underscores the role that we play. I said earlier, this is a nonprofit law office. Mm-hmm. It's a law office. Calls that come to us are in the context of a potential attorney-client relationship. That's where every one of our communications starts. When we get a phone call from somebody who asks, may I speak to you in confidence? The answer is an unqualified yes.
Attorney-client relationship there.
That's exactly right.
That's kind of the buzzword I know from the movies and the books.
Well, and just one quick word. It's an attorney-client relationship if the caller is a person with a disability. Mm. If the caller, for example, is a family member, there is not an attorney-client relationship. If the caller is not a potential client, then we might give advice.
Yeah.
But it's not as a potential client relationship.
Now that makes sense. You're there to serve the individual.
Yes, and we do have that conversation with many callers. We give a lot of information and advice, but we do have to be careful about how we're communicating and with whom.
Now, I kind of want to dig in on a few of ADAP services. So there are quite a few services listed on the website, and if anybody, I'll put up the link. We put it on the broadcasting link there. But ADAP.au.
UA.
I'm
the other side of the state.
ADAP.ua.edu. But you have a few different services listed there, and if you could just kind of go over a few of those.
I can very broadly. So one of the services that we provide, we've already talked about. ADAP provides direct attorney-client representation to a person with a disability who may have a legal claim or dispute. A concrete example would be if an individual who applies for an ID waiver is denied with a statement that that person is not eligible, ADAP looks at those and can challenge the determination of eligibility for waiver services. So an attorney-client relationship is a very basic starting point. We provide a lot of advice and counsel and referral information to a broad variety of callers. Two other things that I'll mention. We have a significant investment in 4 staff who do monitoring and investigations. So they're looking at allegations of abuse or neglect of persons with disabilities.
Now, how do those come in?
They come in through a variety of ways. By federal law, they can come in by a direct report from a caller, but also under the law, if we read a newspaper article, that is sufficient notice for us to determine that we may have probable cause to investigate an allegation of abuse or neglect. So our power to investigate allegations of abuse and neglect under federal law is quite broad. We exercise that power, and as I said, we have 4 full-time folks who do that work throughout the state. Again, all 67 counties. Then one new service that we provide with a significant new grant, we have 3 full-time employees doing investigations of the performance of persons who serve as Social Security representative payees. So for people out there, if you have a concern that a person who is serving as a representative payee may not be acting in the best interest of the beneficiary, we would like to hear your concern, because under a grant that we obtained in the last year, we have the power to investigate those allegations as well.
And an example of that, what would be an example of that?
An example would, let me give you a typical example, one that's been raised to us. Let's say that you have an operator of a boarding home in a large metro area, and essentially the conditions of the relationship are that the boarding home provider takes all Social Security disability benefits when the check is received. That person is serving as the representative payee, and they assert that they provide room and board. Well, if the room and board is grossly below the value that you would expect, then you may have an unscrupulous operator of a boarding home who is not discharging his or her duty as a representative payee. That would be kind of a classic scenario.
I didn't know that a boarding home could be a rep payee. Like an organization can be a rep payee?
An organization can be a rep payee, an individual can be a rep payee. So for example, a boarding home operator could become the representative payee to, say, 6 residents of a boarding home, and take the check of all 6 persons. So you have one individual serving as rep payee for multiple persons.
See, I always thought it had to be like a family member.
It does not have to be a family member.
I didn't know it could be an organization. That's the different end of what I was thinking.
So, for example, there's at least one organization in the state that is a representative payee for more than 250 persons.
Really?
Yes. So we will be looking at the performance of both individuals and organizations that serve as rep payee.
I feel like that is going to do wonders for some living conditions.
We're hoping so, and we want to continue to get the word out about that new effort on our part. And again, that's one reason that we really appreciate being able to visit this morning.
How are the organizations responding to that? I don't think they really have a choice. They have to comply.
They do have to comply. Some have resisted when we've communicated with them initially, but eventually we worked out access. You can imagine that that's an indicator to us about whether there may be something that needs our further review. That being said, we've also been trying to get the word out in ways like this and others. So we've met with some groups of providers who act as representative payees to let them know that we have this new grant and we're going to be coming to review their work.
That's something that I'm a member of the Alabama Service Providers Association, so I'm sure that that's something that they're very familiar with. And
yeah, if we have not met with that group, I know that we've met with a handful of groups. We obviously haven't gotten everywhere, but we would love to come, just say a few words about that work.
I think they're coming maybe this month, or it might be in May, but I'll definitely...
Yeah, let's do it.
Ferguson. So there are quite a few programs that are available, and there are 8 total programs.
There are 8 funding mechanisms for ADAP, and the bottom line is that over the years, Congress has put a set of grants together that allow ADAP to represent any person with a qualifying disability wherever he or she may live. One reason that's important is because, for example, the very first grant dealt only with DD and dealt only with persons with DD in facilities. So it's important that we can represent a person whether they're at home in a community setting or in a facility, and that we can represent any person with any disability.
Out of those 8, I'll say kind of grant programs, specific grant programs, what are the top 3 that you guys receive the most calls for?
You bet. 2 of our 3 largest funders are on the DD and the MI side, and we've made a little bit of reference to both DD and MI at this point. We have a handful of other miscellaneous funders like assistive technology, TBI, voting, but a catch-all is a broad P&A for individual rights that allows us to provide representation to people with disabilities that don't fall into a neat category. A way to think about it would be to think about people who may have a variety of physical limitations. They may have been born with a physical disability and have experienced some challenges. So that's kind of how the funding mechanisms sort out.
Okay. Now, you've said qualifying disability a few times. Who qualifies that? How is that, how do you say this person is qualified with a disability or not?
I appreciate your question, and you're right. There's a reason that we use that phrase. Generally, if a person's disability would qualify as a disability under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, then generally that person is going to qualify for our services. But under federal law, throughout the 50 states, different courts have made different decisions about who is a person with a disability. So let me give you a concrete example. One example, in the 3 states of Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, under federal law, is that a person with a substance abuse disorder and no other disability does not qualify under the ADA. So that's one reason that we just have to be very careful about who qualifies for our services.
Yeah. I was wondering about that. So on the...
But generally, for example, if you have a doctor's diagnosis of a serious mental illness, a developmental disability, or a physical disability that's been identified by a treating physician, generally that's going to qualify under the ADA.
Yeah, okay, perfect. And at this point, I'd like to take a little bit of a break from me questioning you, and I'd like to address the audience here. If anybody has any questions that you'd like to ask Mr. Tucker, I'll give you a few seconds here to do that. And I'd also like to just say thank you for tuning in. Mrs. Dean, Stephanie, good to see you again. Hello. Mary Chambliss, I hope I said that right. Hello, and thank you for pointing out Angie Lamb there. And Mrs. Barclay, Mr. Barclay, always great to see you, sir, and appreciate that. So I'm sure Mr. Tucker's going to say hello as well.
Hello as well.
But if you guys have any questions, feel free to put it up there. I wanted to talk about a recent case that you guys have been working on. I believe it was recent. Is it EPSDT?
That's correct. That's one of 3 class actions that we're involved in. So we represent individuals in a variety of ways. Sometimes we can make a phone call or write a letter and get a problem resolved. Sometimes it's an individual case like a guardianship that we've discussed. But sometimes there are bigger issues that affect a lot of people. And one of the ways that ADAP gets known is through headlines in the paper with regard to our biggest cases. So, for example, we are co-counsel with the Southern Poverty Law Center and 2 other firms in the prison conditions case in Alabama.
I remember, because I actually came and I saw one day you in court down in Montgomery, and that was really cool. The courtroom was awesome.
It is an awesome courtroom. Just a personal note, I mentioned the voting rights and the bus boycott case. Those cases were heard in that courtroom. It's truly a historic courtroom in federal court in Montgomery.
That was the first time I've ever been in a courtroom like that, and it was a great experience.
It's really an extraordinary setting. So that's where the prison trial is being held. But you asked specifically about the EPSDT case, and it's worth a mention. So at its core, EPSDT is federal Medicaid law for children. And the way that works is if a doctor for a qualifying child writes a prescription under federal law, that's a legal entitlement. The distinction here is important. This applies to children, persons up to age 21 who receive their health care through Medicaid.
Okay.
It does not apply to adults. The protections for children are far broader. So in our EPSDT case against the state of Alabama, federal Medicaid for children, we wrote a lengthy demand letter to the governor, previous governor, and identified a significant problem. The state was grossly failing to provide services to children who have 2 major qualifying disabilities. Children who are on the autism spectrum and children who have serious emotional disturbance. So,
I'm not familiar with the word emotional disturbance.
Okay. A way to just roughly translate it would be a serious mental health issue for a child or an adolescent.
Okay.
Generally, those children are not given an adult's DSM-5 diagnosis. So if you have a serious emotional disturbance, SED, that's a rough equivalent for children and adolescents of a mental health issue.
Would that be, I don't even know if this would be on the scale, but like a bipolarism or something like that?
It would, or oppositional defiant. There's a whole range of kind of qualifying conditions.
Okay.
But yeah. So for many, many children in the state of Alabama, they needed services, but the state, through its various agencies, through Medicaid, through the Department of Mental Health, through DHR, and through other agencies, was failing to deliver services to children when the children's doctor said the child needed the service. Under federal law, when the doctor said it, the child was entitled to the service. So, to boil it down, on this one we kind of had the state dead to rights because the state's own websites and literature identified the counties in which they provided services or did not provide services to qualifying children. So
they were aware of it.
They weren't aware. It seems that they weren't aware that the failure to deliver those services constituted a significant failure to comply with federal law. They were aware of the limits in providing services. I don't know that they would have advertised it if they had been keenly aware of the potential legal liability.
Very true.
So we pointed that out in an extensive letter that went to the governor and the governor's legal advisor, and were able to move pretty quickly, I think, to the state's credit, to not fighting about the liability question, are you responsible? But the state pretty quickly seemed to understand that they had a problem that they needed to address. And we appreciate the state's work with us to do that.
Well, I think anybody in good heart would think that those services need to be there. But why would an organization fight against that? What would be a reason that an organization would say, we don't want to provide those services?
Well, I'll give two quick responses. First of all, our state has a long history of fighting plaintiffs in civil rights class action cases, just as a matter of principle. And then that's understandable. The state has sovereign authority and has a great deal of discretion in how it provides services to individuals. In addition, sometimes our state has been skeptical of federal legal authority through a number of questions that have been raised. But one more thing that I would mention is that with that kind of responsibility also comes a requirement that there be an expenditure of public funds. So there's a cost.
Yeah.
So sorting out responsibilities and how costs are going to be met becomes a live and very real question for the state.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I think the state or anybody in that position would want to help kids in need, but the only thing that I could think of is if I wouldn't have, maybe I don't have the resources to do that. That's the one thing that would hold me back, and you're saying that's not an option.
In this case, that was not an option for the state. By law, because the state accepts federal money to deliver a Medicaid program to children and adults, there are certain minimal conditions that the state must comply with. Part of that minimal condition is providing services to the children who we identified.
Now, you're saying some of the children weren't receiving services that the doctors had said that they needed. What would be an example of some of those services?
Well, one of the classic concrete examples would be for children with autism who might need some kind of an in-home therapy. Applied behavioral analysis, or ABA, is a very specific and somewhat popular with some parents, a popular kind of service, but there are other services that we've advocated for also. So, for example, in-home behavior supports and peer-to-peer services. So we're doing those things for qualifying children and adolescents who may have autism or a diagnosed behavioral or emotional issue.
And these things are available for adults, but just not for children. Is that?
Those services are available for adults in different ways. So, for example, a person who's on an ID waiver may be able to obtain in-home behavioral supports. It's not just any adult, and it's not just any adult with a disability who's entitled. All of this is in the context of Medicaid.
Okay.
And it's important to appreciate that 1 million of the state's 5 million residents get their primary health care through Medicaid. So 1 in 5 persons in the state of Alabama.
It's a significant population.
That's exactly right. And in fact, out of that million who get health care through Medicaid, roughly half are children and adolescents.
Yeah.
So that's a big number.
That is. How does the percentage of Medicaid insurance compare to other states? I don't know. I'd like to look at that later, but I don't know if that's something you have off the top of your head.
I don't know the precise numbers off the top of my head, but I know general trends. Partly because our state is a poor state, even in the context of an economic recovery. We are still a state where many people live in poverty. And if you are living in that combination of poverty and disability, then you probably get your health care through Medicaid.
Yeah. Yep. Understand that. Okay. We do have a question here. I'm just going to kind of scroll back up. Holly Cawthorn, hi guys. Jennifer, Terry, James, thank you for coming on today.
Thank you. Glad we can all be together.
Mr. Barclay asked, does elder abuse interrelate with ADAP?
That's a great question.
And how?
It does, absolutely. So there are a couple of ways that we would look at an elder abuse question. So for example, we've already talked a little bit about physical abuse or neglect, but let's talk about an issue that affects a lot of adults, and that would be financial exploitation.
Kind of going back to the rep payee?
You bet. So rep payee would be handled if the person is a Social Security disability or Social Security beneficiary. But financial exploitation of adults, especially seniors, is an issue that can come up outside of the context of benefits or disabilities. So for example, let's say that you have an individual who is older and who's lost some of their abilities. It is not uncommon to see that an adult child may take money from his or her parent. Mm-hmm. That's a classic financial exploitation of a senior. If that senior was a person with a disability, they would qualify for ADAP services, and we could look at that scenario. Mm. Now, I want to say one thing about how we try to work with others throughout the state also. There is a federally funded legal office for all seniors in all 67 counties in the state.
Whether they have a disability or not.
That is correct.
Okay.
So for example, in Tuscaloosa where we sit, that office is run out of the law clinic at the University of Alabama. So we know that there are others who have sometimes more expertise than we have on some of these issues. So if we got a phone call like the financial exploitation, we're probably going to call a colleague in the state who specializes in that area. Mm-hmm. They might want to work the case with us. They may feel that they can take the case, but we're always going to be focused on trying to help the caller get to the right and best place.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So Mr. Barclay, so for elder, with elder abuse, yes, ADAP, definitely call in.
You bet.
And if it's someone without a disability, they can still help you go through that process and get in touch with people.
That's right. The legal services for seniors, that effort is funded out of the State Department of Senior Services, and we're able to help you connect in any of the 67 counties on a question like that.
Perfect. We have Malcolm McSween. I hope I said that correct. He says, good morning.
Good morning.
Does ADAP provide any services that might be of assistance to disabled college students? Or, in the alternative, provide any services to the college itself?
We do. That's a great question, and here's why it's such an important question. When you think about education, children who are attending a K-12 school are not required to tell the school that they have a disability. The school has an obligation through Child Find to identify a child who might need educational services and supports. But the way that works flips when you go to higher education.
So it's the responsibility of the individual.
That's exactly right. If a student is attending a community college or a four-year college, and if that student is a person with a disability and feels that he or she needs assistance, it is the student's obligation to request assistance. So for example, I had a case where the student needed assistance but never had made the request. We weren't able to pursue that case in a meaningful way. So one thing that we advise students who are in college is to contact the Office of Disability Services on your campus early. Let them know that you're there, and then begin the conversation about services and supports that might be needed. Mm-hmm.
And an example of that could it be, I need an extra hour to take this test? Is that an example of?
That is a great concrete example. So if one needs extra time for test taking, that would be an example of an accommodation that might be available to a higher ed student who has a disability. But it's important The only way that you're going to obtain that accommodation of extra test time is by identifying yourself and making a formal request and getting that accommodation in a plan before you go take the test.
Yeah.
You can't ask for time after you took the test.
Yeah, you can't
identify yourself.
Excuse me, this column doesn't work that way.
So let me give you a concrete example. In law school, I had a dear friend who obtained extra time to take law school exams. It was different 30 years ago. He went to a different room and sat down with his typewriter, but it's a concrete example of, in my life, where a good friend in a graduate school obtained an accommodation of the kind that you've identified.
So, Mr. McSween, I hope that answers your question. It definitely did from my point. And so just to kind of reiterate, the responsibility falls back on the individual in higher education.
That's exactly right. The school has an obligation in K-12. The individual has the obligation for higher ed.
Perfect. Okay, Mary Chambliss, is Alabama trying to get Medicare to add dental for age 21 and up?
That's a great question. A couple of years ago, when I was appointed to Governor Bentley's health task force, we raised this issue and we pushed it in that arena. We worked with a doctor in Birmingham, and we are still interested in the issue. But as of today, no. There is no active movement to add dental care to Medicaid coverage for adults in this state. It's an issue that we all need to work together on.
So, Mrs. Chambliss, maybe you are the leader for that push.
I second that motion.
Okay, let's do replying to, thank you. Mr. McSween says thank you. I'm one of the disability service coordinators for Troy University.
Yes.
This is the gentleman that had a question about the university. I'd like to come sit down with you someday and chat.
We would love to do that. I'll also just mention that our legal director has an office in Montgomery. So one way or the other, we would love to meet with you, whether you want to come to Montgomery or Tuscaloosa, or I'd be happy to travel to Troy to sit down and talk with you.
Okay, I'd like to get back to a few of the questions that I have. You mentioned that it does not cost anything for ADAP, so that was one of them. But you also mentioned the P&A system. And you said that that was really the network of all of the state ADAP agencies, and they may not be called ADAP, obviously, for the Alabama, but what exactly is the P&A system? I
apologize for the use of a jumble of letters. P&A is protection and advocacy. So the P&A system, the national system, is a system funded by Congress to protect and advocate the interests of people with disabilities throughout the country. The very first funding that we received more than 40 years ago was only for people with developmental disabilities and only those who lived in state-run facilities. So think of Partlow 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. The very first $50,000 was essentially for Partlow. Since then, the P&A network has grown substantially in ways that we've described today.
And to accommodate a lot of different individuals.
Yes.
Why contact ADAP as opposed to another agency?
That's a great question. So one thing that we always try to explore with callers initially is, let's say that you have a benefit, you're working with a service provider, and you're frustrated with the service provider.
Okay.
Well, the starting point for advocacy should be at an informal level where you are trying to solve a problem. Talk to the service provider, see if you can work it out. The calls that we get are more challenging arise when repeated efforts to get a service provider to be responsive have not succeeded, or when at a core level an applicant is being told that they're not eligible for a service. So, for example, to take a child and an adult example, a parent who thinks their child has a disability and needs special ed supports and services. Many school systems in the state may initially say, your child does not have a disability and does not qualify. So eligibility is a starting point where ADAP may get involved. Another example on the adult side would be if an adult applies for a waiver, a Medicaid waiver for services in the community. Waivers provide services to between 15 and 20,000 people in the state. And once you have a waiver, that waiver is a legal entitlement. It cannot be taken away without due process of law. So if you've applied for a waiver and been told you're not eligible, call ADAP. We will look at that question. So ADAP is not a provider of services. ADAP does not manage case services. We don't do case management. Again, ADAP is a law firm. It's a nonprofit law firm for people with disabilities. The work that we do is through an attorney-client relationship. If you think about it in this context of ADAP's relationship with a service provider, ADAP is going to try to help make sure the person with a disability can get services that the service provider is supposed to deliver.
Through those waivers.
That's correct. But we are not the service provider itself.
Do you get a lot of calls where you say, hey, I'm not happy with my service provider, in just that example, and you have to say, you're not at the point yet where you've done through the steps of contacting your service provider, holding a meeting, a house meeting, whatever that looks like. And do you get quite a few of those?
We do, actually. And Alex, that's really good advice. So the thing that you are describing, you have to recognize that the relationship between a beneficiary and a service provider is, it's a relationship that needs to be based on mutual respect. And so there needs to be some initial effort to address a problem at an informal level before you call a lawyer.
Exactly. Because I think a lot of people would have that jump where it's like, I didn't eat what I wanted to tonight. And there are some serious cases that definitely I don't want to underplay, but it's not like you're going to call somebody on the other end of the line and your problem is going to be fixed, or someone steps in and fixes it. You have to be an advocate, like you said, and make those steps yourself. And if you don't see the results after you've made it, and I would recommend documenting those, then that would be the time when they would call.
That's exactly right. And there's one more piece, and I'll say this just because we haven't used the phrase. We want to help and support people to be better self-advocates. As hard as we try and as many folks as we have in this office, ADAP is roughly the size of the Department of Mental Health Internal Advocacy Office. So it gives you a sense of roughly 24 people. ADAP cannot be all things to all people, and we cannot be everywhere at all times. We very much want to support people to be self-advocates and to be able to obtain the services they need based on their own advocacy. We want to try to support people to do that. If people have tried that and it has failed, then there's a different conversation to be had.
Now, do you say, and you would never want to turn away anybody, but if someone called and said, I'm not getting the results, would you say, have you done these steps, have you documented them? Or maybe contact the provider and say, hey, they told me that they've called these house meetings, what's going on, kind of thing?
We do ask those questions, and I would say that broadly, when we take a case, it kind of falls into two broad areas. Maybe the question is so important or so difficult that no matter the skill of the self-advocate, the question can't be resolved.
Yeah.
That's one possibility. Or, there may be a self-advocate who has a guardian and who, where the caller feels intimidated or feels that the caller just does not have the skills to be able to navigate the challenge. So those are two ways that questions get presented to us where we may well need to get involved.
Gotcha. And I would, I say the provider reference there because I was a family friend that went to just be there as support for that family for someone that wasn't a provider in the Birmingham area, and the father wasn't happy about some of the living conditions that his son was, saying from the home, and it wasn't being resolved after a few. And so he asked that there be another house meeting, and he asked me and my grandfather to come and just be there for support. And there was someone from ADAP there at that meeting. And I thought that it was very powerful. And I think that I've heard after that, I actually ran into the individual that was living in the home at United Ability the other week. And it was like, hey, how's everything going? I haven't seen you in a while. And he's in a new environment, in a different home, under the same provider, but absolutely loving his new situation.
I'm excited to hear that. I mean, sometimes ADAP is able to make a phone call or write a letter and get an issue resolved, or sometimes if a parent goes back to a school and says, I talked to ADAP and I read a right not a favor, sometimes that gets it resolved. We're fortunate in that we're able to do a lot of our work in that way to support people to be better self-advocates. Mm-hmm. But that being said, when there's a serious issue that's presented, we would always want to receive the phone call and to have the chance to think through the question and talk through the question with the caller.
Mm-hmm. Excuse me. Okay. I know we're running a little bit late on time here. I don't want to hold you up too much. But I do want to kind of, in our closing statements here, I kind of want to give you the opportunity of what are you really excited about going on in mental health in Alabama or in the country?
I think broadly, when you think about that, I've mentioned peers already in this discussion. Let me give you a concrete example. Our State Department of Mental Health has done a good job on the adult MI side of initially training 200 persons to serve as certified peers. A person who has a disability who partners with another person with a disability to advocate for an outcome. I believe we've only scratched the surfaces of the peer advocacy movement. Let me give an example of why.
Yeah.
On MI, at this point, it's essentially adults only. Through our EPSDT settlement, we are growing the peer movement in Alabama for children and adolescents. Mm-hmm. Let me give you another way to think about it. Largely in Alabama to this point, peers has been thought of as adult MI. Many states are doing DD peers. We need to really think broadly about how to expand the peer advocacy movement. One more concrete example. People may be aware that managed care is coming to Medicaid big time starting October 1. Starting October 1 this year, 3/4 of all Medicaid recipients will be served through managed care.
Now, what do you mean by managed care?
People will be assigned to a medical group home and their benefits will be managed in a different way. It won't be a fee for service. Medicaid is essentially subcontracting with a middleman to provide Medicaid services to all beneficiaries in the state. It's going to be a big change. We may want to think about how to do outreach together with regard to the coming of Medicaid managed care. Mm-hmm. But I mention it in this context for the following reason. For several years, we've been pushing hard with both of the last two governors and the healthcare policy arm of that office to think about how to support peers beyond DMH, beyond MI and DD. For example, a person with brittle diabetes who can manage that health condition more effectively, maybe with some peer supports and other services, and who through that peer support might avoid an unnecessary trip to the ER.
Yep.
Then you can begin to see how peers is a time peers advocacy is an idea whose time has come.
Mm-hmm.
Not just because people in an ivory tower think it's a good idea, but because providers of health services understand that peers can help individuals achieve better health outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do that, then it also works economically for everybody involved. So a quick answer would be peers, peers, peers.
This is the first time I've heard of peer advocacy, but it's kind of like a buddy system where you guys are helping maybe someone that's more, it's like a mentorship, could be someone that has a little bit more experience, helping someone that's just getting into dealing with some things, that kind of stuff.
That's exactly right. And if you think about a rough analogy, lawyers want to be trained by lawyers, judges want to be trained by judges, doctors want to be trained by doctors. As much as I want to work with my client, I can't pretend that I've walked in their shoes. If they can find a peer partner who's walked in their shoes and maybe walked that path before, then they're going to gain something that I can't do. And it benefits all of us to think more creatively in ways like that.
I like the way you put that, is I haven't walked in your shoes. Maybe there's someone that can relate on a personal level with you a little bit better there.
And that's an example of why I think the peer movement should not be limited to adults with MI. There are numerous places all over the country where there are good, solid DD peer programs and other peer programs. That's a lesson that our state needs to embrace and really learn.
No, I'm behind that 100%. I think that's awesome. And so those are some exciting things, the peer advocacy. What is something, and I know what is something that you think needs a lot of attention, or like one thing that we should really work on as a state and a community?
I'll give you a concrete example, and there's not a legal claim here, but it's a public policy question. Mm-hmm. We've talked a little bit about the limited coverage that our state Medicaid program provides. So for example, it does not provide dental coverage to adults. Well, another way to think about Medicaid is not just what services does it provide, but who does it cover? So this gets into the question of Medicaid expansion, and this is especially a timely question. Just this week, the governor announced her support for a 10-cent tax per gallon on gasoline.
I heard that.
As an infrastructure support. Well, think of the following if you are a business person. If I told you that you could invest a dime and get $1 back,
I'm on board.
And that as many dimes as you wanted to invest, you'd keep getting your dollars back, would you be interested in that as a straightforward business proposition?
I'm looking for change right now.
That's the question that's presented by Medicaid expansion. And to this point, for a number of reasons, our state is one of 14 states now that has chosen not to participate. 36 states have done it. We haven't. We're subsidizing other states. Eventually, I believe that rational economic calculation is going to be appreciated more fully. I think we're on a path by which eventually 50 of 50 states will expand Medicaid. I think it's a matter of time, but it's an issue that we need to talk about as a public policy question.
And does that kind of relate to advocacy with the legislative?
It does, absolutely. Yeah, it absolutely relates to advocacy, and it also has implications for people with disabilities in the following way. Our state is now looking at the question of whether there will be what gets talked of in a shorthand way as a work requirement for Medicaid. The state says that people with disabilities will not be required to perform this work requirement. But our state hasn't defined who is a person with a disability for this purpose. So that's a concrete example of a question that ADAP has a very serious concern about. How will that definition be stated? what people with disabilities will be covered and what people may not be. Those are all important questions.
Is there an event coming up in the next few weeks in March? March is Developmental Disability Awareness Month. Is there an event that you're really looking forward to or would recommend that the community attends if they can?
There are a couple of big events coming up. Let me mention a couple. There are going to be a couple of rally days at the legislature. So, for example, on March 20th, NAMI Alabama, an advocacy organization for people with mental illness, is organizing a big rally. There will be a breakfast that morning at 8 o'clock and a rally on the legislative steps at 10 o'clock. There are other rallies being planned by advocacy groups, and then there are other big events coming up later. So, for example, in April, the state's largest gathering of MI consumers will happen at Chaco Springs. Usually that's a gathering of 800 to 1,000 people.
Wow.
And then later in the year, State ARC will be hosting their annual disability conference. That's in September, I think, in Montgomery. So very soon on the calendar, and then further out. Those are some of the big events that are coming up.
Yeah, I'd like to get to one of those legislative rallies this month. I've never been a part of that process, and I'd like to learn what that looks like.
We'll work with you to share that information so that we can get it out to everyone looking in.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Okay, I'm going to scroll through here, make sure there's no additional questions that we haven't been able to get to, and it looks like we have not. So at this point, we're going to bring it to a close, but is there anything that we didn't cover that you would like to address?
The last thing that I would say is we're incredibly fortunate here at ADAP to have really great staff who know what they're doing and know how to talk to callers who may have been scared or intimidated to make a first phone call. Mm-hmm. We would really rather people call than not. If you call, we know we can help you with resources. We have a lot of information. We don't want a person with a disability who has a question to not call because they're afraid to call. So I just want to strongly encourage people to make the phone call if there's a question that you have that you think we might be able to help with.
Yeah, and you can find that information on their website. It is ADAP, and what I'll do here is I'll kind of minimize our camera angles so you can see more of the website. adap.ua.edu.
Roll Tide.
And then we have the contact information down here at the bottom. And so if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to call in. And Mr. Tucker, it has been an absolute pleasure being here this morning, and I greatly appreciate you being on Alabama Care. It's always fun being around you, sir.
Thank you, Alex. It's great to visit. And thank you to the audience.
And at this point, we will stop the live stream. Appreciate everybody being here, and see you next week.